All right, this is a second video in the series on how markets work, focusing on supply. So now we're going to be looking at things from the producer's point of view rather than the consumers. We know the law of supply says that as prices go up, so we have an increase of prices, supply will go up with it. People will supply more and produce more of a good because prices have gone up. And as prices go down, supply will go down also. People will produce less goods when the price has gone down. This is all driven by, we know what drives producers is profit motive, right? People go into business to make money. We like to think that, they also want to supply goods and stuff, but the big thing is money, right? Nobody starts a business I should say very few people start a business just to altruistically supply pizza or sneakers or hats or whatever it is to people that are looking to make money. That's why people start a business. So they're driven by profit. So when prices are high, they want to produce more of a good. When prices are low, they have less incentive to produce as much of that good. One way you can think about this, sometimes it's confusing because some people might think that if prices are low, then you would have an incentive to produce more of them, more of that good because you're making less per good. But you think about the way the incentives work. If we use an example to illustrate it, if I were going to offer you an extra credit paper in class and say, if you write this extra credit paper, I'm going to give you 5 points on your final grade. Some of you might say, well, think about the resources that goes into writing a paper. You might say, well, I'll spend 30 minutes writing a paper and it may only be one page and not that great because it's only 5 points, and I don't really, 5 points isn't going to change my grade that much. If I were going to say, well, what if I made the paper worth 10 points on your final grade? You might say, well, now I'll spend a little bit more time. I want to make sure I get this paper done well, so I'll spend an hour writing this paper because 10 points can change my grade from a B to an A. And let's say we're going to say, I'll give you 15 points for this paper. You might spend 90 minutes writing it, an hour and a half. That's 3 episodes of The Office you couldn't watch because you were going to sit down and write a paper that took you 90 minutes for 15 points. You might go from an 80 to a 95, and that's a huge increase. And if I said, I'll give you 20 points, maybe you spend 120 minutes. You'll spend a solid 2 hours making sure no stone is left unturned and that this paper is perfect because you want to get that full 20 points to go from an 80 to 100. So we were thinking about, that idea of profit motive. You're willing to spend here more of your resources and time as the incentive goes up, right? You might think of these points as being the profit, right? You're going to get more points on a paper the more time you spend on it. You're willing to allocate more of your resources, which is your time that you could be spending doing other things, to write this paper to get more points on it. So I use that to talk about, if we think about supply of goods, why that illustrates it, that if you think about if you were going to make lemonade, and we use our example of a lemonade stand. So you're opening up your lemonade stand and you're going to charge $1 for a cup of lemonade. You might really not be willing to spend any money or spend any resources supplying lemonade because maybe it costs you $1 for the cups and the materials and all the other stuff that you have to spend on to buy lemonade. If you thought the price of lemonade was $2, you'd be willing to spend a little bit more time or some time at all, right, providing lemonade because now you're going to make a profit per cup. Let's say it's $1 per cup to produce it. So now you're going to make $1 per cup. You make $5. So you think, okay, that's worth it for maybe I'll spend an hour at a lemonade stand for $5 or 30 minutes, however long it would take. But you think about to produce this, you have to buy the resources, and the most precious resource is your time. You'll stand there and sell lemonade enough to sell 5 cups for $2 a cup. If for whatever reason we thought you could make $3, you're like, well, wait a second, now that's $2 a cup or $3 per cup. The price of lemonade, thinking now I'd be making $2 per cup, and that's a little bit more worth it to me. So maybe I'll stay out there for 2 hours and I'll sell and produce 10 cups because that's it's $20. That's a decent amount of money. I can go and buy fun things with $20. And if you thought the price that you could get for lemonade was $4 per cup for whatever reason, you'd stay out there longer and produce 15 cups. And if you thought you could get $5 per cup, you'd stay out there for 4 hours and produce 20 cups of lemonade because there'd be a huge profit. That'd be tons of money. So that'd be $80 for that time. So you think about how that works with supply and demand, right? This is similar to graphing it. So this is our, by the way, our supply schedule. Oops. Our supply schedule, when we show this in data form, and we see that law of supply as price goes up, quantity goes up with it, right? So we have a correlated effect there. So if we're going to graph that on a chart here, as we did, same thing with demand, we always put price on the vertical axis, and we put quantity down here on the horizontal axis. So we got our supply graph. So we were going to graph that. We'd say, okay, at $1, at $1, we'd be willing to supply no, we'll do this in green, we'll supply no cups of coffee. 0, right? This is 0 quantity down here. At $2 a cup of lemonade, we'd be willing to supply, let's see, 1, 2, we'll do this, we do this in increments of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So we can make our graph a little bit smaller there. We're able to do every other one. This will be 5, this will be 10, this will be 15, this will be 20, and this will be, well, I guess we only have to go to 20. All right. So at $1, we're willing to supply 0 cups of coffee. At $2, we're willing to supply 5 cups of coffee. At $3, we're willing to supply 10 cups of coffee. And at $4, we're willing to supply 15 cups of coffee. And at $5, we're willing to supply 20 cups of coffee. So we have a line, a demand curve now that goes upward to the right. So this is our, I'm sorry, not demand curve. This is our supply curve. So we see that it goes in the opposite direction of a demand curve. It goes upward to the right because it's showing the opposite effect, that as prices go up, people want to supply more. Quantity is going to go up with it. And that's because of profit motive, right? So at all these different points, I'd say at $2 a cup, I'm not making much profits. I don't want to spend much time. If $5 a cup, I'm making huge profits. I'll spend a lot more time and resources producing, and I'll increase my production. So we have that inverse relation rate. We have an upward movement to the right. This is similar to in demand in some ways. We still have the effect of ceteris paribus, if you remember. That's Latin for all things being constant and things won't change. So we think about ceteris paribus, the idea that if there's a price change, it's already shown on all these things, right? So I already know that at $1, I'll produce no cups of coffee, and at $5, I'll produce 20 cups of coffee. So if you're going to say, well, what happens if the price changes from $1 to $3? It's not going to cause this line to change. I'm just going to move along the line and see where I've already determined that I would be willing to produce 10 cups of coffee, right? So that change is already present on that line. So a price change does not cause this line to shift, just like with demand. This is ceteris paribus. If all things are equal, if nothing changes other than price, all we're doing is moving along an existing supply curve showing how much I'd be willing to produce at these different prices. If we think about things that can shift, again, we have the idea of shifters in supply, just like demand, that some things can cause this entire line to move. So we can look at some of these things, and we can look at, if we're going to graph out the supply of, let's see, when we use this as an example of, we'll stick with lemonades, right? So this is supply of lemonade. Oops. Supply of lemonade. And we've already determined that our supply line might look something like this. Right, so this is we have price over here. We have quantity down here. We've already determined this is our supply of lemonade. If there was a change in input costs, right, so we could say that no longer ceteris paribus exists. There's a change outside of price. Input costs have gone up. So in this case, we'll say resources. If all of a sudden it costs more money to produce lemonade because lemons have gone up or sugar has gone up or the lemonade mix, whatever it is, has gone up, that I would make less profits per cup of lemonade. So if we were looking at on this line that previously, before there was any changes, at let's put some values on here to make it a little bit easier to explain. So let's see, we'll do 1, we'll make this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we'll put down here 1, we'll do 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, right? So this may not line up exactly with our schedule that we just made, but if we were looking at this along the idea of if resources were to go up, or the cost of resources were to go up, so we have a change in input costs, at all these different lines, I'd be willing to produce less. So let's say at $25, I was willing, I'm sorry, it looks like about $2.50, I was willing to produce 25 cups of lemonade. right? So I was, okay, that's a decent price and I'm gonna make some money, but all of a sudden it costs more for me to make lemonade because say the price of lemons went up, I'm gonna make less profits. Well, maybe now I don't wanna spend as much time out there making lemonade because my profits will go down. So if we were gonna say the price at 250, I would say, well, I'm not willing to make 25 anymore. At 250, maybe I'm only willing to make 15. So we can see that at 250, I'm only willing to make 15 cups of coffee rather than 25 like before. So we'd have a change in that quantity supplied if my input cost of resources has gone up, and that would be the same at all these different levels, right? We look at all these different things and say, at $2 my supply will go down, at 150 my supply will go down, at 350, at $5, we'd have this whole line would shift to the left. And this can be, so it's labeled as one, supply two. We'd have a shift to the left. This can be kind of confusing because some people, visually, this looks like an increase in supply because the line is higher than it was. But we're not thinking about supply going up or down. We're thinking about going left or right. A decrease for supply and demand always goes to the left, and an increase will always go to the right. If you ever get confused about that, just think about plotting it out, right? So if you had a decrease in quantity supplied at 250, just think of, okay, well, a decrease would go this way as far as quantity goes, right? Our quantity would be going down, so therefore this line would go to the left. So if the cost of resources were to go up, my input cost, my supply would go down because I'd make less profit per cup, and I have less incentive to stay open because I'm going to make less money per cup. The inverse of that would be true also. If the supply, or say if the cost of resources were to go down, I'd be willing to supply more cups at all those prices because my profit levels will go up. Another input cost here would be labor. Right, so it's similar to resources. If I paid someone to work here, let's say I had employees and I was paying them $10 an hour, and I decided to cut their pay by $1 an hour. So instead of getting paid $10 an hour, they're getting paid $9 an hour. That means I would make more money per cup of lemonade because I'm paying my workers less. So that means I would be willing to, in a sense, supply more lemonade at all these different prices because my profits would go up and my line would shift to the right. That would be an increase in supply. So I'd make more money per cup because my labor costs went down. Or you can think of labor costs might even be I fired someone, I laid someone off, so I have less people to pay. And then the opposite would be true too. If there was an increase in minimum wage and I had to pay people more, then I would make less money as I sold lemonade and I'd be willing to supply less of it. Either hire less workers, which means I supply less, or close my stand earlier so I can pay them less and my supply would go down. We'd have a shift to the left and we'd have a change in supply. So input costs can cause this whole line to change, right? So we talked about ceteris paribus. If price changes is the only thing, then the line stays the same, but some things cause the line to move. Some things are shifters, and input costs would be a shifter in supply. Another shifter in supply would be technology. So we could think again, oops, wrong color. So we can think about if we were going to do a graph for, say this is for manufacturing cars. Oops. If we were going to manufacture cars and I had a new technology that made it so I could produce cars more efficiently, right? So automated assembly line, I with the same amount of workers before the technology, I could only produce 100 cars. Now I can produce 200 cars. And my labor costs haven't really gone up. So we think about that with supply. If we had our supply line for cars, so at all these different prices, whatever cars might cost, if a price is high, if I can get this much money for a car, I'm willing to supply lots of cars, so quantity would be high. If the price of cars was low, I'd only be willing to supply this many cars. But the technology has made it so that at all these different price points, I can supply more cars at the same cost because the technology is so efficient. My line would go up, right? I'd be willing to supply more cars at all these different prices. So this would be supply one, this would be supply two. We'd have a shift to the right because I could produce more cars at the same cost, which means I can get more and more profits. I have an incentive to keep my factory open longer, to get the resources and do all the things I need to do to produce more cars because people will pay these prices and I can make more of a profit per car. So a change in technology then can cause an increase in supply. I suppose theoretically a change in technology could cause a decrease, although I can't think of an example of what that would be. So generally speaking, I would say a change in technology is always going to cause, or most of the time going to cause an increase in supply. Another shifter of supply would be government policies. So we think about government policies, how those could change supply. So again, we're thinking about it from the producer's perspective, right? So if you produce, we go back to the, let's stick with cars since we were talking about that. If I produce cars, some different government policies could be things like, you see here, taxes. So if the government were to say, we're going to tax companies' profits more, so let's say we have a supply line that says how many cars I'm willing to supply at all these different prices because I want to make money and make a profit, and the government were to say we're going to tax corporate profits more. So of the money I make per car, I have to give more of it to the government, which means I get to keep less. I might say, well, it's not as worth it to me to produce as many cars as before. So before, when I used to produce at this high price over here, I produce this many cars. I might say, well, now I don't want to do that anymore, and now I want to produce this many cars at that high price because the government's going to take some of those profits. And at this price, maybe I only want to produce that many, and at this price, I only want to produce that many. This whole line would shift to the left. We'd have a decrease in supply because I have less profit motive to produce cars and do all the things that is required to produce a higher quantity of cars. My line would shift to the left. There'd be less incentive to do that. And the reverse would be true too. If they were to give this massive tax break, then I'd produce more cars. Subsidies could be one too. If we got rid of this and we talked about subsidies, well, I guess actually cars isn't a bad example for subsidies because we could think about, let's say there's a subsidy for electric cars. So the government wanted to promote companies to produce electric cars, and say whatever company this is Renault Core, right? And this is how many electric cars I was willing to produce before, and the government were to say, we're going to give you a subsidy. We're going to give you free money in a sense, because to shift over your production, you're going to have to create new assembly lines, train new workers, do some research and development to produce these electric cars, shift over from making gasoline-powered cars to electric cars. And so before that, I might have only been willing to produce this many electric cars at all these different prices because it would cost too much money to really focus on increasing that production. But the government gave me free money and a subsidy to do that. Well, my costs would go down. And I'd say, well, before I only wanted to produce, so much, say this price, this many electric cars. But now I'm willing to produce this many electric cars because the government subsidy means that I get to keep more of my money as a profit. And at this price, maybe I'm willing to produce this many cars. And at this price, that's gone. That could cause this entire line to shift to the right and causing an increase in supply because the government gave me money, which means that I get to keep more of my own money. I get to make more of a profit. So subsidies could cause an increase in supply. Think about regulations. If there was regulations for things like, let's say we took that off and said that we're going to make regulations for cars, and this new government regulation will require some sort of environmental, there's an environmental regulation which would mean I have to change the way I produce things or put new devices on cars or change my factory and the way we pollute. So all those things are going to cost me money to implement. So I might have a less of an incentive to produce cars because of the government regulations. So all these lines, all these dots might change, whereas I was willing to produce this many cars at a price before, the government regulations would make me say, well, maybe I'm only willing to produce this many cars now because I'm going to have to spend more money every time I create a car to follow these regulations. And maybe all these lines would change, and that government regulation may cause a decrease in supply because I get to spend more of my profits, what would have been my profits, to produce these cars. Or, other regulations might be safety regulations. When we think about this, it sounds like I'm saying it's really bad, and, obviously there's a plus and minuses. If we had environmental regulations, good for the environment, right? If we had safety regulations so workers weren't getting injured on the job, then that would be good for the workers. But it may cause a decrease in supply because really, think about businesses are in it to make money. So if their profits are going to go down because they're spending money on regulations, they're less likely to want to supply as many of these goods. So government policy can impact supply. Think about price of related goods. So if we were to go back to our example of the lemonade stand and think about if we had a line here, not a very straight line, but if we had a line here of, we're talking about lemonade. So we were looking at how much lemonade we're willing to supply, and we had all these different prices and quantities, and the price of a related good. So we're talking about not buying it, right? So let's say it costs me a dollar thinking $1 per cup to produce lemonade, and all of a sudden someone says, well, wait a second, you could produce cocoa because the price of cocoa has gone down. So let's say there's a change in the price of a related good. Cocoa powder has gone down and now would cost me 50 cents per cup to produce cocoa. Well, I might say, well, I'm going to shift over some of my production from lemonade to cocoa. So what we have here graphed is the supply of lemonade. This cocoa is not shown on this graph, but since I might shift more of my resources over to producing cocoa, that means I might supply less lemonade. So all of a sudden I say, well, I used to want to produce this much lemonade at this price, but now that I can shift over to cocoa, I'm only going to produce this much lemonade at that price because I can produce more cocoa and make more of a profit. So the price of related goods could cause supply to go down. So this would be supply 1, this would be supplies 2. I shouldn't say down, that's confusing. It could cause a supply to shift to the left, a decrease in supply because of a price of a related good. You can think of the same thing sometimes if, like producers might produce like corn. And if they're producing corn and all of a sudden the price of wheat's gone up, they might next year plant more fields to produce corn rather than wheat because they can make more money off of corn. So price of related goods can cause that line to shift. We think a number of suppliers. This is, you think about just the idea that if there's more people supplying something or less, it's going to go up or down. So if we go back to lemonade, and I'm producing lemonade, let's say in a neighborhood, this is how much lemonade's being produced because I'm the only producer in the neighborhood. And then you saw how much money I was making. You said, I'm going to supply lemonade too. Well, in this neighborhood, all of a sudden there would be more lemonade being supplied because there'd be 2 of us supplying it. So all these lines, I used to only have this much lemonade being supplied because I was the only one doing it. But now this much lemonade is being supplied because someone else has jumped in and started competing with me. We'd have more lemonade overall being supplied, and we'd have a shift to the right. And then the opposite would be true if this person dropped out of the lemonade market. We'd have a decrease. The line would shift back to the left because there's less people supplying it, right? So number of suppliers. If there's more people supplying it, you're obviously going to have more supply on the market because there's more people producing it. Future expectations of prices could be one too. You can think about that similar in some ways to demand, right? So we're going to talk about if I was going to make here, say Red Sox t-shirts. So let's say I was making them right now and the Red Sox had a very bad season. I'd be willing to supply so many Red Sox t-shirts at so many prices because I anticipate that, this is how much money is going to be made. If next season they made a bunch of trades and all of a sudden they had all these great players and the season started and they started doing good and I anticipated they were going to have a really good season, maybe make the playoffs and win the World Series, I could get more money next year. We got to think about this too, maybe before that, right? So Red Sox right now, they stink, so the prices, nobody wants to buy a Red Sox t-shirt. But if this happened over the summer, and I anticipate next summer or next spring, the Red Sox, more people buy Red Sox t-shirts because there's better players and their expectations of winning are higher. I might say, well, I'll produce less Red Sox shirts now. Why spend the money making Red Sox t-shirts now when nobody's going to buy them because the team stinks? I'll hold on to those resources, or maybe I'll produce them and keep them in inventory and not put them on the market, and I'll wait until the price goes up in the future. So if I expect the price of my good to be higher in the future, I'll produce less of it now, and my supply would shift to the left. It would decrease. Because why sell it now at a lower price when I expect people would pay more for it in the future when I could get more money? So maybe I still produce them, I just don't supply them to the market, right? So maybe I make some t-shirts, put them on some shelves, get them boxed up and get ready to distribute them when all of a sudden everybody wants Red Sox t-shirts and they would pay more money for them. This, of course, depends on the whether you can store this good. If we were producing like milk or something like that, you couldn't do that because the milk would go bad. But if you're producing something that can be storable, then I might wait until prices go up in the future and hold on to it. And the inverse would be true now. Let's say I was making Red Sox t-shirts and the season just started and everyone thought the Red Sox are going to be good. And all of a sudden they start, maybe I have some, I predicted they're going to be bad because I look at competition out of the teams and I think the Red Sox are going to stink. So in a month from now, nobody wants to buy Red Sox t-shirts. I might try to get more of those shirts on the market now while people are buying them. So this would be supply 1. So if I expect in the future nobody's going to want to buy them, then prices would go down. I would supply more of those goods now. So this would be supply now of Red Sox t-shirts before people don't want to buy Red Sox t-shirts. So depending on what I expect to happen in the future, that could cause my supply to increase or decrease. External shocks is our last one. You can think about that with if we were looking at supplying things like, say, the oil supply in the country. If you had this is showing our oil supply. If there was a hurricane that were to disrupt oil shipments in production in the Gulf, all of a sudden there's less oil in the market. That could cause a decrease in supply at all these different prices, just simply because production capabilities are down because of the hurricane. You can think about this with, say, oranges too. Like, in Florida, they make oranges, and they're expecting to supply this many oranges if the season was well, but they got some, bad weather, maybe early frost, and a bunch of the oranges died and weren't able to be harvested. That external shock could cause a decrease in supply, and supply will go down. Other external shocks could be things like war. If that go back to the example of oil, if this is how much we were willing to supply to the market for oil, and then we went to war, and some of that oil had to go to the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, there may be less supply of oil on the domestic market for us because there'd be more of it going to the Army. Or maybe if there was a war in the Middle East, there was less supply coming out of the Middle East because of the war. So those would all be external shocks, things in a sense outside of the economy that would create a change in those things. And then last thing we can look at is elasticity of supply, similar to demand. Elasticity, wrong color. Elasticity gauges how much price changes will change the production or supply of a good. So if we were going to look at various goods, these are things that can affect that storage possibilities, like I mentioned before. That if you can't store a good, then it's going to be more inelastic of a supply curve. So we think about that. If we're producing something like milk, and we're going to say at $1 I'll produce 100 gallons of milk. At $2, oops, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, at $2 I'd be willing to produce more goods, more milk. And at $3 I'd be willing to produce this much milk. Didn't quite meet it even, right? But we'd have a steep line of supply. We call this inelastic. Because if, let's say, at all these different prices, and up here, let's say, so that's $5, and this is, we produce 500 gallons of milk. If the price were to go down, this would be a steep line, because even if, I want to charge $5 for milk, that would be great, and I would supply this much milk. But if the price were to go down, it wouldn't change drastically, right? It wouldn't have a huge change because I can't store milk. My only alternative is to stop producing it or dump it down the drain or whatever it might be, but it's tough to stop producing milk because cows produce milk and you have to milk them, so I'm going to have the milk either way. So what do? I'm probably still going to supply it. My quantity will go down. There'll be a change in quantity, but it's not going to be drastic because I can't store milk. It's going to go bad. So storage possibilities would change. And if you were thinking if this was some other good that was like, say, if you produced basketballs or something like that, if you're a basketball producer, you might say, okay, if the price of basketballs is $5, I'll produce 1,000 basketballs. If the price of basketballs is $4, maybe that changes drastically. Maybe that's down to like 600 basketballs, and then at $3 it would continue to change. Oops, that'd be down here, and then $2. So we'd have more of a shallow line, right? Because the difference is I can store basketballs. If I thought the price were going to go down, or if people were spending less on them, I can produce them and just put them in a warehouse and not sell them to the market until the prices go back up. So something like basketballs would be more elastic, because there are storage possibilities for basketballs, but not for something like milk that would go bad. The other thing would be ease of production. The book is a good example of ease of production for, say, like if you have an apple orchard. So if you have an apple orchard, you're going to have a very steep line of supply because you can't easily change your production of apples overnight if prices change. So if people all of a sudden, we will talk about equilibrium price later, but if the market were demanding less money for apples, let's say we went from $4 to people want to spend $2, I can easily change how much I supply of apples because the trees take years to grow, and then it takes a whole year for the apples to grow. I can't, or let's say the price were to go up, that might be easier, right? So it was instead of getting $2 for apples, people want to pay 5. I mean, in theory, I'd want to spend, I'd want to produce this many apples at $5 because I can make tons of money. But the problem is I can't all of a sudden grow new trees overnight and produce more apples, so my line would be very steep. I couldn't drastically change my quantity supplied if prices went up. So something like that, I wouldn't think of ease of production, that would make it inelastic if I can't easily change how much of a good I supply. The other example they gave in the book was haircuts. I can easily change how many haircuts I give. If I thought I could get, let's say these prices wouldn't really apply, but let's say that $5, $10, $15, $20, $25. If I could charge as much money for haircuts, I might be willing to supply a ton of haircuts at $25 because that's a lot of money. And maybe at $20, it would go down a little bit, but not a ton. But as you got down to $15, it might start changing quite a bit. I don't really want to produce haircuts at $15, and at $10, it would change down to zero, right? I wouldn't want to produce any haircuts at $10. We'd have a more shallow line of supply because I can easily just shut my doors and not cut people's hair, or I can easily stay open longer and cut more people's hair if the price is higher or lower. So this would be an elastic supply. So the ease of production, how easily you can change production to adapt to prices determines how steep or shallow that slope might be. All right, so that ends our video on supply. The next video will be on prices.